At 8:17 on a Saturday morning, my 79-year-old mother-in-law asked my husband for a ride to the bank. Eric laughed. Figure it out, Mom. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug in one hand and a dish towel over my shoulder, and I remember looking at him like maybe I'd heard wrong. Dorothy hadn't asked him to move a piano. She hadn't asked him to drive her to Cleveland. She wanted a ride downtown. That was it. Eric had his phone propped against the sugar bowl watching some football recap while Dorothy was on speaker. "Eric," I said. He held up one finger at me. "Mom, Monday's my day off." Dorothy's voice came through the phone, small but perfectly steady. "I know. That's why I asked. I've been traveling all week. It'll take an hour." Eric sighed like she'd asked for a kidney. "Call an Uber." There was a pause. Then Dorothy said, "All right, sweetheart." That was Dorothy. If you pushed her, she usually didn't push back. She just got quieter. Eric ended the call and picked up his coffee. I said, "That was rude." He looked at me. "What was rude?" "You laughed at her." "I didn't laugh at her. You literally laughed." He gave me that irritated little half-smile husbands develop after enough years of marriage, the one that says they have already filed your complaint under things we don't need to discuss. "She'll be fine, Becca. She's 79. "She's not 99. "That is not the defense you think it is." He went back to his phone. I should probably tell you that this wasn't some dramatic turning point where I suddenly realized my husband was selfish. Real marriages don't usually work that way. You notice things in pieces. A missed call here, a forgotten errand there. A sentence that bothers you then gets buried under laundry, dentist appointments, electric bills, and whether somebody remembered to defrost the chicken. Eric loved his mother. I believed that then, and honestly I still believe some version of it now. But loving someone and making room for them are not always the same thing. Dorothy lived about 15 minutes from us in Lidditz, in the same brick ranch she and Frank had bought back in 1978. Frank had been gone 7 years. Union electrician. Quiet man. Fixed everything himself and labeled the circuit breakers in handwriting so neat it looked printed. After he died, Dorothy kept the house exactly the way she wanted it. She mowed half the yard herself until she was 76. Still baked choufle pie at Christmas. Still refused to use online banking because, as she put it, if somebody wants my money, they can at least put on pants and go to a bank. 2 days before that phone call, she had turned 79. I brought over a little chocolate cake from Giant and a pot of yellow mums. Eric came too, technically. He stayed maybe 20 minutes. 10 of those he spent answering emails from work. At one point, Dorothy was telling him about a leak under her bathroom sink, and he said without looking up, "Text me a picture." She did. 3 days later, I called the plumber. That had become normal. Dorothy needed batteries in the smoke detectors I went over. Her furnace guy needed someone there between noon and 4. I rearranged my schedule. She needed help carrying mulch bags in spring. Eric said his back was bothering him, so I did it. And every single time I somehow told myself the same thing. We're helping his mother, not I'm helping his mother. Funny little word, covers a lot of territory. The thing was, Eric never seemed too busy when Dorothy mentioned the house. That house had been paid off for years. Lancaster County real estate had climbed enough that Eric had started making comments. Not mean comments. Jokes. That's how people get away with saying things they know they shouldn't say. One Sunday afternoon, maybe 6 months earlier, Dorothy mentioned that a house down the street had sold for more than $400,000. Eric whistled. "Mom, you're sitting on our retirement plan." Melissa, his sister, laughed. I didn't. Dorothy was rinsing coffee cups at the sink. She stopped for half a second, then kept rinsing. Nobody said anything. On Monday morning, I left our house around 9. I hadn't told Eric I was taking Dorothy. I didn't hide it either. He was still in sweatpants when I grabbed my keys. "Where are you going to get your mother?" He looked up from the couch. "For what? The bank." "Oh," that was all he said. "Oh." When I pulled into Dorothy's driveway at 9:15, she was sitting on the front steps, navy coat buttoned to the throat, black purse beside her, hands folded in her lap. It was chilly enough that I could see the edge of her breath when she stood. I rolled down the window. How long have you been sitting out here? She picked up her purse, long enough to decide these steps need power washing. I got out and took her elbow. You could have waited inside. I was inside all morning. That doesn't answer the question. It answers enough of it. She smiled at me. Dorothy had a way of ending a subject without being rude. I drove us into Lancaster. Traffic was light, and she spent most of the ride complaining about a woman in her book club who kept spoiling mysteries before everyone finished them. I asked twice what she needed at the bank. Both times she said, housekeeping. At one point I said, that sounds suspicious. She looked out the passenger window. At my age, paperwork is suspicious. The bank was downtown, the kind of branch with polished glass doors and people who seemed to walk faster once they got inside. I offered to go in with her. She said, no, sit. Drink your coffee. I already drank my coffee. Then sit and think about another one. So I waited in the car. 40 minutes. I know because I checked the dashboard clock more than once. At 35 minutes I started wondering if I should go inside. At 38 I saw her through the glass. At 40 she opened the passenger door and got in. She didn't say anything at first. Just put her purse on her knees. Then she reached inside and took out a small brass key. Not a house key. Smaller. Plain. She placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. I looked at her. Dorothy, keep that somewhere. Eric won't find it. My first thought was that I didn't want it, whatever it was, whatever it opened. I tried to hand it back. She pushed my hand toward me. No. What is this? She looked straight at me. There was no smile this time. No joke. Nothing uncertain in her face at all. Then she said very quietly, my son has no idea what he just lost. For a few seconds I just sat there with that little brass key pressed into my palm. What did he lose? Dorothy reached for her seatbelt. Let's get lunch. Dorothy. I'm hungry. You cannot hand me a mysterious key, tell me my husband just lost something, and then ask where I want lunch. She clicked the buckle into place. I can if I'm 79. That almost made me laugh. Almost. We ended up at a little place north of Lancaster where Dorothy liked the vegetable soup. She ordered that and half a turkey sandwich. I got coffee because apparently I had become exactly the woman she'd predicted 40 minutes earlier. I put the key on the table between us. All right. Dorothy glanced at it. Put that away. You put it there. I put it in your hand. Fine. I slipped it into the zippered pocket inside my purse. Dorothy stirred her soup. Then, without looking up, she asked, how many times do you think Eric came to see me last year without you? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. Guess, Dorothy? I don't keep track. I do. That shut me up. I thought about Christmas, Easter, her birthday, the afternoon we brought over patio cushions before a storm. But I had been there for all of those. 10, she shook her head. 6-3. I stared at her. No, yes. That can't be right. It is. She wasn't angry when she said it. That made it worse. She took another spoonful of soup. February, when he needed Frank's old tax records. June, when he wanted the extension ladder. And September. What happened in September? He wanted to know what I thought the house was worth. I leaned back. That one hurt. Not because I thought Eric was waiting for his mother to die. I wasn't ready to think that. But because I started doing some arithmetic of my own, the plumber, the furnace inspection, the prescription Dorothy forgot at the pharmacy, the handrail Eric promised to tighten for 3 weeks until I finally watched a YouTube video and did it myself. I had always said we took care of it. There was that word again. We. Dorothy must have seen something change in my face. Don't make yourself guilty over my son. I'm not. You are. I should have noticed. You did notice. You just kept translating. I looked at her. What does that mean? Every time Eric didn't come, you explained why he couldn't. Every time he forgot something, you remembered it for him. I wanted to argue. Instead, I thought about her birthday card from the year before. I had bought it. I had signed, Love Eric and Becca. Eric hadn't even seen it until Dorothy opened it. I took a drink of coffee. So, what happened at the bank? Dorothy wiped her mouth with her napkin. Frank and I did all right. That was not the answer I expected. She told me they had never been rich. Frank had his union pension. They saved steadily. He had life insurance. They invested conservatively mostly because Frank distrusted anything that required a man on television to shout. The house had been paid off years ago. Between everything she said, she was worth somewhere around $1.4 million. I nearly dropped my cup. Dorothy gave me a look. Oh, don't be impressed. Half of it is a house I bought when Jimmy Carter was president. Eric knows. He knows enough. That sentence bothered me. She explained that for years her will had been simple. After a few charitable gifts, Eric and Melissa would divide almost everything equally. That's what Frank and I wanted. And now I want you to keep the key. She was doing it again. Dorothy. She sighed. I'm not discussing my will over turkey sandwiches. You brought up your will. I'm 79. I'm allowed to be inconsistent. There was the smile again. But then she told me something I hadn't known. Melissa had already asked about Dorothy's jewelry. Nothing outrageous, just whether Dorothy still wanted her to have Grandma Nolan's pearl earrings someday. Eric had gone further. He had talked about paying off our mortgage, replacing his truck. Once, apparently, he'd mentioned a fishing boat. With what money? Dorothy looked at me. I already knew. I remembered a conversation in our bedroom maybe 6 months earlier. Eric had been going through bills. He said, once Mom's gone, we'll finally have some breathing room. I had snapped at him. Your mother isn't a CD waiting to mature. He told me I was being dramatic. We didn't speak for an hour. Then life resumed. That's the frightening thing about certain sentences in a marriage. Sometimes they should stop you cold, but instead you load the dishwasher. Dorothy reached across the table. The key isn't the money, Becca. Then what is it? You'll know when you need to. I hated that answer. I don't like keeping secrets from my husband. I know. I mean it. I know that too. Then why give it to me? Dorothy was quiet. Finally, she said, because if I gave it to Eric, he'd find out what it opened before I got home. I laughed once, despite myself. She didn't. That evening, Eric was making spaghetti when I got home. He stirred the sauce and asked, how'd Mom's bank thing go? Fine. What did she need? Bank stuff. He stopped stirring. Bank stuff. Yes. What kind? I set my purse on the chair instead of the counter. I noticed myself doing it. I don't know, Eric. She went inside. I waited in the car. That part was true, mostly. He watched me for a second. Then he went back to the sauce. Later that night, I moved the brass key out of my purse. I put it inside an old sewing tin in the back of my closet under a stack of winter scarves. I felt ridiculous doing it, and disloyal. The next morning, Eric called Dorothy before work. No answer. He called again while tying his shoes. Still nothing. She's being weird, he muttered. Maybe she's in the shower. No. She's been talking about changing things lately. I turned around. Changing what he looked at me, and I saw immediately that he'd said more than he meant to. Nothing. Eric. He exhaled. A few weeks ago I stopped by and there was an envelope from Martin Keller's office on her kitchen table. Martin had handled Frank's estate. I knew the name. I asked her why she was talking to him. And Eric gave a humorless little shrug. She said, because I'm 79. At my age, paperwork becomes a hobby. That sounded exactly like Dorothy. But Eric wasn't smiling. For a man who had been too tired to give his mother 1 hour of his Monday, he suddenly looked very awake. And for the first time I wondered whether the bank trip hadn't surprised him at all. Maybe he'd been waiting for it. 3 days later, Dorothy called me at work. Can you come by tonight? I tucked the phone between my shoulder and ear while sorting insurance forms at the front desk. Sure. Everything okay? Yes. Then she added, bring the key. That got my attention. At 6:30, I pulled into her driveway and found Eric's truck parked at the curb. I sat there for a second. Then Dorothy opened her front door. Eric came out behind her. He looked irritated. Perfect, he said when he saw me. What happened? Nothing happened. Dorothy folded her arms. My son came over to fix my printer. Eric looked at her. I did fix your printer. You also opened my desk. I was looking for the warranty. Dorothy nodded slowly. In the drawer with my birth certificate. Eric threw up his hands. Here we go. I looked at him. Why were you in her papers? I just told you. Apparently Hewlett-Packard warranties are filed with Social Security cards now, Dorothy said. I nearly smiled. Eric didn't. He stepped closer to me. Did she give you anything Monday? There it was. Not, how is Mom? Not, why is she upset? Like what, I don't know. Papers. Something from the bank. Dorothy said, go home, Eric. He stared at her. I'm trying to help you. No, Becca helps me. You inventory me. That landed. Eric's face changed. He left without another word. I waited until his truck disappeared before turning to Dorothy. You knew he was going to do this. I suspected he'd get curious. Curious, I lowered my voice, even though nobody else was there. He went through your private papers, I noticed. This isn't funny. I didn't say it was. For the first time, Dorothy looked tired. Not frightened, just tired. She sat down in Frank's old recliner. I started to tell her maybe we should forget the whole thing. Give the key back. Let Martin handle whatever needed handling. Leave me out of it. But Dorothy said, tomorrow. 10:30, same bank. So the next morning, I rearranged my work schedule again. When we arrived, a man was waiting near the lobby. Martin Keller was 64, silver-haired with wire-rimmed glasses, and the calm expression of someone who had spent 30 years watching families become unreasonable over perfectly reasonable pieces of paper. Rebecca. He shook my hand. Thank you for coming. I'm not sure why I'm here. That makes two of us, I said. Dorothy ignored me. We were taken into a private room. Dorothy signed a form, and a bank employee led us through another secured door. That's when I understood the key. Safe deposit box. The employee brought out a long metal box and left us alone. Dorothy handed me the brass key. You open it. Why me? Because my hands shake when I'm irritated, and I've been irritated since breakfast. Martin looked down, hiding a smile. I unlocked it. There was no cash, no diamonds, no stack of bearer bonds from some movie. There were photographs tied with an old rubber band savings bonds, the deed to the house, Frank's union papers, several envelopes, and a bundle of documents held together with a binder clip. Dorothy lifted out a large envelope. Across the front, in Frank's handwriting, were the words, Eric and Melissa if necessary. I looked at her. Frank did this. Frank documented everything. That sounds like Frank. It was exhausting. She handed the envelope to Martin. Inside were copies of checks, notes, and several signed agreements. The first one I saw was for $12,000. Eric's signature was at the bottom. Another was for $18,000, then $9,000, then $20,000. What is this? Dorothy sat down. Money we've given Eric over the years. Given, Martin answered carefully. Some were gifts, some were documented loans, some were advances that Frank recorded with a stated purpose. He showed me the pages. A down payment, credit card debt, taxes, money. Eric put into a side business that lasted about 11 months. Altogether, the records showed roughly $94,000 had gone from Frank and Dorothy to Eric over 12 years. I felt embarrassed looking at it. It seemed private. Then I saw a date. June 14, 2018, $20,000. I read it again. I knew that date. Not because I had a magical memory. Because that summer Eric and I had been scared. Our roof needed replacing. My car's transmission was failing. We had carried a credit card balance for almost a year. Then Eric came home one Friday and told me he'd received the biggest sales bonus of his career, $20,000. We sat at our kitchen table and made a list of what we could finally pay off. I had hugged him. I had told him I was proud of him. I looked at Dorothy. What was this $20,000 for? She glanced at the paper. Your roof, I think. I couldn't speak for a second. He told me it was a bonus. Dorothy's face changed. He told you that? Yes. She looked genuinely surprised. That hurt more than if she'd known. Martin quietly gathered the papers into a neat stack. I sat there thinking about how many times I'd heard Eric complain that his mother expected too much from him, $20,000, and he'd made her sound needy. Dorothy touched my wrist. Becca, I didn't know. I know. That was the moment the bank trip stopped being about Dorothy and Eric. It had entered my marriage. Martin explained the rest. Dorothy had revised her estate plan. Not in anger after Monday. She had started months earlier. The house would eventually be sold. A substantial portion of the estate would go into a charitable fund supporting senior transportation and home safety programs in Lancaster County. Melissa would receive a fixed amount. Eric would also receive something, but documented loans and advances would be accounted for against his share. And Becca, Dorothy said. Martin looked at me. Mrs. Nolan has nominated you as successor trustee? I actually laughed. No, Dorothy raised an eyebrow. No, absolutely not. You haven't heard what it involves. I don't care if it involves handing out cookies. Your children will think I did this. Martin said, you can decline. Good. Dorothy didn't argue. That bothered me more than if she had. She simply folded her hands and said, I'm not asking you to punish my son. I looked at her. Then what are you asking? To make sure nobody punishes me for making my own decision. The room went quiet. I stared at the documents again. The $20,000 note was still on top. My husband's signature looked exactly the way it did on our mortgage. I had spent years explaining Eric to his mother. Now I was sitting in a bank vault learning that he had been explaining his mother to me, and neither version had been true. I didn't agree to be Dorothy's successor trustee that morning. I didn't refuse either. I told Martin I needed time. He nodded. Dorothy said, of course, no pressure, no guilt. Which frankly was inconvenient. It would have been easier to say no if she'd behaved badly. 2 days later, she called Melissa. I know exactly what Dorothy said because she told me afterward. I finally got my new paperwork finished. Martin helped me. Becca was kind enough to drive me. That was it. She didn't mention the trust. She didn't mention the safe deposit box. She certainly didn't mention $94,000. Melissa called Eric within 20 minutes. By dinner, he knew. I was rinsing lettuce at the kitchen sink when he walked in and dropped his keys on the counter. You went to Martin Keller with my mother. I turned off the faucet. I drove her. Don't play word games. I'm not. What did she sign? Ask her. I am asking my wife. There was something about the way he said my wife that made it sound less like a relationship and more like a department he supervised. I dried my hands. Then your wife is telling you to ask your mother. He stared at me. Are you in her will? No. That was true. Did she make you executor? No. Also true. His eyes narrowed. What did she make you? I hated the question because I still hadn't accepted anything. But I hated myself a little more for wanting to protect him from the answer. She asked me to be successor trustee. Eric laughed once. It wasn't a happy sound. You've got to be kidding me. I haven't agreed. You shouldn't have to think about it. That hurt. Not because I wanted the job. I didn't. Because 17 years of marriage should have earned me something better than immediate suspicion. He paced into the dining room and back. You've inserted yourself into my family's money. Your mother's money. You know what I mean? No, actually. I'm beginning to think I don't. He slept in the guest room that night. I barely slept at all. The next week was awful in the ordinary ways. We went to work. We took out the trash. Eric asked whether I had paid the electric bill. I asked if he needed anything from Costco. Then we'd pass each other in the hallway like two people sharing a hotel room after a canceled flight. I kept thinking about the $20,000, not because of the money itself, because I remembered hugging him. I remembered saying, you earned this. And he had let me believe it. A week later, Eric and Melissa called what they described as a family meeting. Dorothy invited me. I almost didn't go. Then she said, I'd rather have somebody there who remembers what was actually said. So Thursday, I sat at Dorothy's dining table with a cup of coffee I never touched. Melissa had driven in from outside Philadelphia. She looked uncomfortable from the moment she arrived. Eric had a folder. That worried me. He opened it and slid several pages toward his mother. We're not trying to take anything away from you. Dorothy looked down at the papers. That's a promising beginning. Melissa sighed. Mom, what can we just talk? We've been talking for 79 years. You brought forms this time. Eric leaned forward. This is a power of attorney. If something happens, Melissa and I can help with bills, medical decisions. I already have those documents. With Martin? Yes. Who did you name? Dorothy looked at him. Not you. His jaw tightened. We're your children. Dorothy sat back. That's biology, Eric. I'm discussing behavior. Nobody spoke for a moment. Melissa looked down at her hands. Eric didn't. You're letting Becca get between you and your family. There it was. I said, leave me out of this. You're sitting at the table. Because your mother asked me to be here. Exactly. Dorothy's voice sharpened. Stop talking about me like I'm in another room. Eric pushed his chair back. I'm trying to protect you. From whom he looked at me. Dorothy saw it. So did Melissa. The meeting ended about 5 minutes later. Dorothy didn't sign anything. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, driving home, I realized I was scared. Not of Eric. Of what 17 years could turn into if we kept going like this. The next afternoon, Dorothy made an appointment with her longtime physician. On Martin's recommendation, she also agreed to meet separately with another attorney who had no connection to me. I suggested it. Dorothy didn't object. If everybody wants proof I know what I'm doing, she said, I'll give them proof. She was found fully capable of managing her affairs. The second attorney met with her alone and reviewed the important documents independently. I wasn't in the room, neither was Eric. That should have ended the argument. It didn't. A few days later, I was using the laptop Eric and I kept in the den. I needed to print the confirmation for a continuing education seminar at work. His email was still open. I wasn't snooping. I wish I could say I immediately closed it. I didn't. Because the subject line had my name in it. Re Dorothy Nolan, Becca Nolan involvement, I clicked. Eric had contacted an elder law attorney. He had asked whether Dorothy's recent decisions could be challenged on the basis of diminished capacity or undue influence. Then I reached the sentence that ended something in me. Eric had written, My wife has increasingly isolated my mother and positioned herself as the person Mom depends on. I read it twice, isolated. I thought about all those rides, church, the pharmacy, birthday dinners, groceries. The afternoon I sat in Dorothy's kitchen waiting for the furnace technician because Eric had a tea time he'd forgotten about. I had spent years making sure his mother wasn't isolated. Now he was willing to turn that into evidence against me. Eric came home while I was still sitting there. He stopped in the doorway. He saw the laptop. Then my face. You read my email. You called me an elder abuser. I did not. You said I'm isolating her. I said it could look that way. To whom he didn't answer. To a lawyer, Eric Becca, I was asking questions. About taking away your mother's right to make her own decisions, about protecting her. From me. His voice rose. From whoever is influencing her. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, You know what I did every time you forgot your mother's birthday? He frowned. What? I bought the card. He stared at me. I signed your name. When you didn't show up, I told her you got stuck at work. When you didn't call back, I told her you were traveling. What's that got to do with anything? Everything. I stood. I spent years telling Dorothy what you meant, instead of paying attention to what you did. He shook his head. You're making this into something it's not. Maybe. I still wondered that myself. That's the part I'd like to pretend wasn't true. I still loved him. I still remembered the man who sat beside me all night when my father had surgery. The man who made pancakes on Sundays and knew I hated driving in snow. 17 years doesn't disappear because you find one ugly email. But it can crack. And once you hear the crack, you start noticing how much weight you've been putting on it. The next morning, I opened a checking account in my own name for my paycheck. I copied our mortgage insurance and tax records. Then I made an appointment with a family law attorney. I didn't file for divorce. I wasn't even sure I wanted one. But for the first time in 17 years, I stopped explaining Eric to everyone else, including myself. Dorothy turned 80 11 months later. A lot can happen in 11 months without anything looking dramatic from the outside. Eric and I were still married. Technically. We had gone to counseling for 4 months. Some weeks I thought we were making progress. Other weeks Eric would say something like I never cared about the inheritance, and then spend 20 minutes explaining how unfair the new estate plan was. Our counselor finally asked him, Eric, if it isn't about the money, why do you keep giving me numbers? He didn't enjoy that session. I did a little. Dorothy, meanwhile, went on with her life. She attended church, complained about grocery prices, got cataract surgery on her left eye, and developed an inexplicable devotion to a British detective show she couldn't follow because she refused to turn on closed captions. Melissa started visiting more, not constantly, but enough that I noticed. She took Dorothy to an eye appointment in March without announcing it to anyone. In May, she drove out just to have lunch with her mother. Eric visited too, though those visits had a strained quality to them. He was trying, I will give him that. But trying and expecting credit for trying are cousins, not twins. For Dorothy's 80th, she reserved a private room at a family restaurant outside Lancaster. Nothing fancy. White tablecloths, roast chicken, salmon, mashed potatoes, coffee that tasted like it had been introduced to a coffee bean sometime that morning. There were 22 people. Family, a few neighbors, 2 women from Dorothy's church. Martin Keller and his wife were there too. Martin and Frank had known each other for years, so his presence wasn't unusual. Eric arrived carrying an enormous arrangement of lilies. Dorothy looked at them. My goodness. I know you like lilies. I like tulips. Eric blinked. Dorothy patted his arm. They're beautiful. Then she leaned toward me. Amazing what inheritance anxiety does for a man's manners. I nearly inhaled my iced tea. Dinner went surprisingly well. Melissa told a story about getting caught smoking behind the garage at 16. Dorothy denied ever knowing. Melissa said, you grounded me for a month. Oh, then I must have had suspicions. People laughed. For an hour we were almost a normal family. After the cake, Eric stood with his wine glass. I hadn't known he was giving a toast. Neither had Dorothy. To Mom, he said. Everybody quieted. 80 years young. Dorothy muttered, don't push it. More laughter. Eric smiled. Then he talked about family, how important it was to stick together, how parents make sacrifices for their children, and children return the favor when parents get older. It wasn't a bad speech. That was what made it uncomfortable. If you hadn't known us, you would have thought it was lovely. Then he said, whatever disagreements we've had this year, family comes first. Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Then she stood, slowly. She didn't tap a glass or ask for attention. She didn't need to. Thank you, sweetheart. Eric sat down. Dorothy looked around the table. Since my family has spent an impressive amount of time discussing my money while I'm still alive, I thought I should clear up one thing. You could hear silverware stop. Eric's expression changed. Dorothy picked up a single sheet of paper beside her plate. I've made some changes to my estate plan. They are my decisions. Nobody talked me into them. Melissa went very still. Eric said, Mom, this isn't the time. Dorothy looked at him. You brought up family. I didn't bring up money. No, you usually wait until we're alone for that. Nobody laughed. Martin stared at his coffee. Dorothy continued. She didn't announce dollar amounts. She didn't read her will. She simply explained that part of her estate would eventually support local programs that helped older people remain independent, transportation to appointments, small home repairs, safety modifications. She said both her children were still included. Then she folded the paper. That could have been the end of it. It should have been. Eric stood. Did Becca write that I closed my eyes for half a second? Dorothy said, no, did Martin. No. Then why is she trustee? There it was, right in front of 20 people. Martin's wife looked down at her plate. Melissa whispered, Eric, sit down. He didn't. This whole thing started when Becca took you to that bank. Dorothy's voice remained calm. No. This started long before that. Eric pointed toward me. She inserted herself into this. I had spent months imagining what I would say if this happened. Every version was better than what came out. Eric, stop. Not exactly Churchill, but I meant it. He turned to me. You're really going to let her do this? And suddenly the right answer was obvious. Eric, she's your... Why are you asking my permission? He stared at me. Nobody moved. Dorothy sat down again. Martin finally spoke. Eric, since you've raised this publicly, I'll answer publicly. His voice wasn't loud. That made everyone listen harder. He explained that he had met with Dorothy privately. A second attorney had reviewed the documents independently. Dorothy's physician had found no concern regarding her ability to manage her affairs. I had not been present when the important decisions were made. Eric's face reddened. This is ridiculous. She's punishing me. Dorothy looked tired. No, Eric. Yes, you are. For what the bank, he spread his hands. For whatever you've decided I did. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you really want me to answer that here? That should have stopped him. It didn't. Go ahead, Melissa whispered. Oh, for God's sake. Dorothy looked at Martin. He didn't move until she nodded. Then he opened the slim folder he'd brought with him. Not for a performance. He had been helping Dorothy update some records that afternoon, and Eric had just turned those records into dinner conversation. Martin said, There are documented advances and loans made to you by your parents over approximately 12 years. Eric's expression changed. How much one of Dorothy's cousins asked before immediately looking embarrassed. Dorothy answered. About $94,000 altogether. Nobody said anything. Then Cousin Ray, who had apparently had enough wine to lose his internal editor, said, That's one hell of a fishing boat you haven't bought yet. Someone at the far end of the table coughed into a napkin. I looked down because laughing would have been terrible. I came dangerously close. Eric said the money had been gifts. Martin calmly explained that some had been. Others had signed documentation, and Dorothy had chosen to account for those advances in determining Eric's share. Then Dorothy said the thing I think finally reached him. I love you. Eric stopped. I love you, and that's why I spent years making excuses for you. Her voice softened. But I'm done financing the excuses. Eric looked around the room. There was nowhere for his anger to go without making him look worse. So he picked up his jacket and left. No slammed chair, no shouted threat, just the door closing behind him. Melissa stayed. After most people had gone, I found her in the corner beside Dorothy. She was crying quietly. I did it too, she said. Dorothy touched her hand. Did what left everything for Eric, because he lived closer. Then blamed him when it didn't get done. Dorothy didn't rescue her from that admission. She just nodded. Melissa wiped her face. I'm sorry, Mom. Dorothy squeezed her hand, and for the first time that entire day nobody mentioned money. Eric didn't come home that night. He stayed at a hotel near Lancaster. The next morning he texted me 3 words. We need to talk. We had been saying that for almost a year. This time I believed him. We met at home that afternoon. Eric sat at the kitchen table where 7 years earlier I'd hugged him over that $20,000 bonus. Funny what a room remembers for you. He looked exhausted. I shouldn't have done that yesterday. No, I was angry. I know, I felt ambushed. You gave the toast, Eric. He rubbed both hands over his face. I know, that was different. A year earlier there would have been a but attached. I waited. He said I made myself look like an ass. Yes. He looked at me. You could soften it a little. I've been softening things for 17 years. That ended that. Eric and I didn't divorce the following Monday. There was no dramatic suitcase by the front door, no champagne with girlfriends, no moment when I woke up feeling gloriously free. We tried counseling again. We ate dinner together. We spent Thanksgiving with my sister. For a while, Eric seemed genuinely willing to look at himself. Then we'd slide backward. He would say the money didn't matter and ask whether Dorothy had changed the percentage again. He would insist he wasn't angry with me, then mention that none of this would have happened if I hadn't driven her to the bank. One evening I finally said, if I'd stayed home that morning, your mother still would have made her decisions. You don't know that. Yes, I do. How? Because this was never about a ride. That was the part he'd never understood. The ride was simply the moment Dorothy stopped pretending. Our separation happened 4 months after her birthday. I rented a 2-bedroom townhouse on the other side of Lancaster. The second bedroom was technically an office, although for the first 6 weeks it mostly held unopened boxes and one lamp I couldn't figure out where to put. At 49, I learned that starting over is expensive in very boring ways. Security deposit, utility deposits, a new shower curtain, a can opener because apparently the can opener belonged to the marriage. Nobody warns you about dividing kitchen utensils after 17 years. Eric kept the good potato peeler. I remain bitter about that. But there were harder nights too. I'd sit on my couch and miss him. Not the version of Eric who searched his mother's desk or wrote that email about me. I'd miss the man who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, the man who drove through a snowstorm when my father was hospitalized, the man who knew I hated the fitted sheet and always folded it himself. Both men had been real. That's what made leaving difficult. If he'd been terrible every day, I would have left years earlier. Our divorce became final the following spring. There wasn't a winner. We sold the house and divided what we were supposed to divide. I kept working at the physical therapy clinic. Eric kept his job. Neither of us ended up ruined. Dorothy was furious about the divorce for approximately 6 minutes. Then she said, "I'm sorry." "For what, my son?" "Dorothy." "I raised him. You also raised Melissa." She considered that. Fair point. She never tried to give me money. I was grateful for that. What she gave me instead was lunch every other Wednesday. By then, Dorothy had decided the old house was too much, not because Eric told her, not because Melissa pressured her. She decided. She sold it and moved into an independent living community about 10 minutes from me. Her apartment had 2 bedrooms, a little balcony, and maintenance staff she adored. The best part, she told me, is when something breaks, I call a man I didn't have to give birth to. She played cards twice a week, joined a walking group, complained that the dining room coffee could remove paint. Melissa visited more often, and Eric did too. At first, Dorothy told me his visits were awkward, 20 minutes, half an hour. Then one Sunday he stayed through dinner. A few weeks later he took her to an appointment. Nobody congratulated him. That mattered. He was her son taking his mother to an appointment. It wasn't community service. One afternoon, Dorothy told me he's getting better. I'm glad. He asked if I'm changing the will back. I nearly choked on my tea. Dorothy grinned. "What did you say?" I told him. "No," I laughed. Then she shrugged. "I can forgive him without paying him for improving." That might have been the smartest thing she ever said. Eric continued visiting. The estate plan stayed exactly where Dorothy wanted it. Melissa never complained about hers again, and I eventually accepted the successor trustee role. Not because Dorothy wore me down, because after enough time had passed, I understood what she'd been asking. She wasn't giving me her fortune. She was trusting me to follow instructions. There is a difference. About a year after I moved into the townhouse, I was sitting on Dorothy's balcony when she suddenly said, "Do you still have that key?" I knew exactly which one. I went home and found it in the sewing tin. The next week I brought it to her. She held the little brass key between 2 fingers. "Oh, good. You want it back?" "No." She handed it to me again. "The safe deposit box is closed." I stared at her. "So this doesn't open anything?" "Not anymore." "Then why have I been guarding it like the nuclear codes?" Dorothy laughed so hard she had to put down her coffee. I tried to hand it back. She pushed my fingers closed around it exactly as she'd done outside the bank. "Keep it." "Why?" She looked at the key, because apparently it was the only key in this family that ever got anybody's attention. I laughed. Then she got quiet. People think getting old means you stop noticing how they treat you. That stayed with me, because for a long time I thought this story was about money. Then I thought it was about Eric. For a while I even thought it was about my marriage. But Dorothy had understood it before the rest of us. Neglect doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes there's food in the refrigerator and heat